Good.
Cool. And do you mind if I audio record?
Oh, no, please do.
Okay. And what's your name?
My name is Brian.
Brian.
Actually, Bryce.
Just first name is fine.
That's fine. You'll see it pop up here soon because I got a lot of stuff in the works with what you're doing right now.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And so, hi. Did you have a question?
Well, I'm wondering what you're promoting.
Oh, I'm not promoting anything. Just conversation is all I'm promoting.
Diving into the cognitive bias of association to see how people associate their lives to the belief systems that they're living in their current political climate. Yeah.
All right. So do you have something in mind you want to talk about? These are just suggestions
this is
down
good.
here.
I'll let you lead.
No, I insist
Okay,
that
okay,
the
yeah.
people pick
All
what
right,
it is.
that's cool. So the thing that I would like to dive into is the question that I get with the Black Lives Matter, our current political climate, and everything and where it's at. The one thing that I've noticed, being on both sides of the fence and seeing where the disconnect happens emotionally is I'm watching a world in a state where I call it the identity crisis. For the first time, people are all have one common thing happening with this pandemic, and people are being face to face to mortality, to actually acknowledge it. Now, for the generation of people who are 50, 60, 70 plus, the mortality factor is a whole different perspective because they're living it, where if you take the younger generation, oh my gosh, I'm afraid. And it's like, what are you afraid of?
Yeah, so you spanned a whole bunch of topics there.
Absolutely.
But,
so I'm going to funnel it right to this one.
Okay, let's do that, please.
The fundamental of belief.
Fundamental of belief.
And then versus truth.
Okay.
And fundamental belief versus the fundamental of thought, the origin of thought.
Okay.
So taking the belief, what I believe is irrelevant because I've broken it down to the fundamental of the origin of my thought, so I'm actually creating the life I live right now. I'm not reacting to everything happening in the world because I get to question everything. And
Is questioning not a reaction?
questioning is a form of understanding so that I can be more available to respond. The world spends their entire time reacting. So to emotionally react, if somebody says, hey, Black Lives Matter, one person says all lives matter, or somebody says, hey, red or versus blue, I get to speak to what is it that they believe. Because I know to the origin of thought, people aren't being challenged intellectually enough, and that's where the disconnect is in society.
Why do you think that is?
Society is placed, if you take generation from generation, what's been passed down from parents to parents, it's become this dichotomy of people saying, okay, how do I operate in a space where, if you take in the society of man, what's a man? Don't share your emotions, don't speak about don't share your thoughts. What's it to be a woman? To be nurturing? That's the disconnect. So it's taking the centuries and the decades of old models that are being replayed in a modern time where information is so readily available that the disconnect is happening because people are holding on to a belief and not actually challenging it to understand for themselves.
So are you suggesting like there's a conflict between like old ways of knowing and like the phenomenon of like say social media or something like that?
Absolutely. I would say that the thing that the disconnect in society today is the spiritual part of it. And the spiritual not speaking to religion, because religion is subjective to demographics.
So what does spiritual speak to? It seems like people use that word very sort of amorphously, and some people have a supernatural attachment to that.
Absolutely.
And other people don't.
Absolutely. So, spiritual going to, if we're tying to, for instance, my spiritual belief, I can say that I'm Christian, but I don't have to say that Christianity is what I live because I'm living under God, which is one. I've dissociated myself to saying I'm one thing because it's God, which is everything. And if God is in all of us, let's go into Scripture. If it is universal, if we are all the same, and we're all of the same thing, and we're all creators, then why is it that man judges another man? And why is it that wars are fought over religion? When in religion, if we break down the Bibles and all the different scriptures and all the cultures, they all have the same common when you go to the 10 Commandments. You get into Sikhism and it goes into the 5 evils of lust, greed, anger, attachments, and ego. All of these are presented in every single religion, yet we are sitting here saying that one's better than the other. And so when I speak to spirituality, I speak to...
Do you think that all religions are you saying that they're all the same, or
No, I'm saying they all have the same roots.
Okay, all right.
They all have the same root,
So-
which comes down to being a kind human being and being inclusive in nature and built around community.
I mean, I can just think of a few off the top of my head that are that have a sense of inclusive,ness, but also have very much a sense of the other.
Absolutely, a lot of bias in a lot of religions.
Yeah.
Every religion has bias.
And perhaps that's why they fight.
Exactly, right? And that's the thing. If you took morality out of it, and if you took morality out of society, everybody's right. If you took perspective and just looked at it, if we all looked at everybody's opinion as just their perspective or their empirical truth as their perspective, everybody is right. In this current political climate, everybody is right. Morality is the only thing that makes it wrong, because now we're speaking to the thing of the preservation of life. So,
Is it possible for everybody to be right?
everybody's going to be right in their own relative perspective. Everything's relative to perspective, so everybody's right. But if it's saying, is it right in alignment with me, I can say I disagree, and it is not the life I'm living. Now we're speaking to that spiritual side of it.
So, like, if, for example, I mean, maybe this isn't what you're talking about, but like if somebody takes two rocks and puts them together, and there's 4 rocks, and then somebody else says there's 5 rocks, can both people be right?
Only relative to their perspective.
What does that mean in the context of, like?
So in the context of, let's go into the presuppositions to life, right? I'm gonna speak to the cognitive, and I'm also gonna speak to the applied psychology and the origin of thought. So perspective is speaking to, if somebody sees 5 rocks, if they are dyslexic or they have something within their own brain that helps them to perceive that, they are right. Now, that is not saying that it is the right in terms of the all right. Like if you take, for instance, I can sit there and say, let's just speak to a topic that everybody knows intimately right now. You know, racism. You know, racism is you can't discriminate as a racist, because discrimination would actually require one to actually be able to use their cognitive abilities to dissociate between 2 things. And to go deeper into it. So now if we were to dissociate between black and white, well, then we have to go down to the actual thing of human being. And if somebody's discriminating, well, now we're actually speaking of being prejudiced. So what I look at now is it's the linguistic dynamics where people are struggling.
Right, that's what I was going to say. It seems like you are you're playing a semantic game where you're not, and I don't mean to imply negatively. I'm just saying,
absolutely.
like, if we like go back to the rock example, if we agree on what 2 means, if we agree on what 4 means, and the only way someone who says there's 5 can be right is if they change the definition of those words.
Exactly. Now we're getting back to the cognitive bias of association, and that's where the world's disconnected.
Right, and that's, I mean, it seems to me that if you apply that ability to just change definitions of words at will, then societies fall apart. You can't.
Well, that's the thing. Society fell apart a long time ago because the definitions of words.
When would you say that happened?
That happened pre-colonial times. You know, we're going back to, like, you know, why do you think we have the Socratic method? Because even back then they were questioning everything. Those were ways to get people to actually look in places they weren't looking. But that was exactly how, if you take in all these great empires, they rise and fell, those were all in the same realm. But now we're dealing with the struggles of power. You know, so then taking and saying, okay, how do I get people to conform to an ideal? And that ideal is exactly what we see in our current political climate. We say that it's for the people, but then for the people are suffering trying to get things together, and yet alone, we're like, there's this thing called time, but everything's based on the time what's happening in our current house. So essentially, when I speak linguistically, the breakdown, Speaking to our modern time, when information is absolutely available, we have all the information. This is the century where ignorance is like not even an excuse anymore, right? So now it becomes this thing of people have now go emotionally, have been living their lives. Fear and pain make money. Fear and pain drives an economy. Fear and pain is exactly what the house, if you take just speaking to the political climate, they're playing off back and forth. So if we're taking the emotional state of people, if I ask somebody what their definition of pain is, they will describe it in 100 words easy. But when I ask them to describe what happiness looks like using emotional words, they'll use one word to describe it, like joy or taking care of my family. So now that's the part where we speak to that emotional disconnect.
Do you think there's a remedy for this
Absolutely.
This problem?
Absolutely.
What would you say that is?
Thoughtful one to go into thoughtful conversation, but two, to actually have people leading by example.
So how do people engage in productive and thoughtful conversation if everybody is if we don't agree to like definitions of words?
Absolutely.
Or the idea that not everybody is equally right all the time?
Absolutely. And that actually speaks to exactly what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
Is asking
like
questions.
at this very moment?
At this very moment.
Okay.
You know, so to have these moments, I know that by me doing this, I know that people are walking by, people are seeing what's happening, they're seeing me engage, and because I'm leading by example, the human brain cannot conceptualize what it has not experienced. So by me leading by example, now they're piquing their curiosity. So for one to actually be courageous and take courageous steps to step outside of the box,
right.
This is what it looks like to make change, just like you're making change by sitting here.
Right.
You know, so it really happens down to what's conscious living versus what's, instinctive living. You know, people are living saying they're surviving, but to actually be living consciously means that I can look at it and say, I am aware that we have a disconnected society. I am aware of a victim mentality because be known to you, I was a high school dropout that lived out of a car who had a mom that married 4 times and believed the nightmare I was living was never going to end. And in 2013, I was driving to jump off a bridge. But here I am now in a place where I'm leading people to go deeper into themselves to understand that it's not just about the external stimuli that's being put on them, that is their empirical truth. Because most people, if you take when the language, you say, okay, what happened with English? What happened with people speaking? Well, what happened there is childhood. Childhood happened. People, what do people spend their entire lives doing? People spend their entire lives living to avoid the feelings that they know they don't like. They spend their entire lives giving to others, which they wish someone would have given to them. So now we're getting into this whole spiraling breakdown where people are literally living to be a polar opposite than what they came from. And all of a sudden, when they're going through moments in their life, experiencing things that they've never done before, they're triggered back to that same associated feeling of fear that is not even with the same intention, physiologically what they're feeling, that they're going through right then in their time, which is why you have emotional triggers.
That's a lot.
And that's what I'm saying, right? But that's the difference with conscious living.
Yeah.
That's the difference with conscious living versus somebody who's emotionally living. I'm not saying I'm dissociated from my emotions. I'm saying I understand my emotions and I understand the origin of my thoughts, so that when I go back to a childhood moment, I can say, "Oh my God."
Do you know? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
do you know he's an author, but he also is. I think he's a psychologist of some sort. Jonathan Haidt.
Nah, no.
So he's a real interesting guy. He talks about the relationship between the emotion and the emotion being the elephant, and the rider being the mind.
I actually use that, where if you take the elephant and then the stick and you teach them something when they're a kid and you move that box away and a stick.
Well, no. He talked like the elephant being like the emotional response, and the rider being like the intellect, the guide or the intellectual response, the sort of knowledge base, and how it's often like real difficult for a person to distinguish who's leading who inside of themselves,
Absolutely.
And I wonder, like, you brought up earlier the example of Black Lives Matter,
right.
and that's an issue where it seems on both sides there is just an emotional response
Absolutely.
to that sort of thing, and which just takes the rider, on a rampage through the woods to where the point where the rider can't control it. And you try to have a conversation about
Right.
those topics.
And there's a root that you speak to.
Right, but people can't, because the elephant is so in control.
Yeah.
The riders can't talk.
So what I learned about controlling the elephant and the riders when they're both standing in front of me is I tell them that they're both right, because now we're going back to a debate. And in a debate, when somebody has a belief, they're right in where they're at, but that doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but I have to acknowledge them. And that's where the problem in society is. Everybody wants to be acknowledged. Everybody wants to be heard. So that when two opposing sides aren't acknowledging each other, no one's open. Well, if we talk about what is candor, right? If we speak to candor, see, people use candor wrong. Candor's not even based on truth. Because truth would mean, if you were to speak with truth to candor and say, hey, somebody's faults, let me speak to truth. Well, truth discriminates against somebody else's faults. So you can't use
discriminates against.
Right? So if you think about it, what is candor? Candor is to speak without judgment or discrimination, right? So if you take truth and somebody says, hey, this is what I know, this is where I'm at, and you're like, to be honest, that's actually not where it's at there, no, that's not it. Well, all of a sudden it becomes this thing of, okay, how do you approach somebody and grant candor? Because nobody knows how to even grant candor, create candor, would it be candid with each other? Which means that I would have to, if what I thought was candor was going and challenging the fundamental of thought, because we're getting to radical candor, right? Because that was a big thing that people were talking about back in the 80s and 90s, or early 2000s and 90s with business models, where they're like, well, radical candor is how you make a business thrive. Well, all of a sudden, if you take the word radical can mean extreme, which is the word you hear right now with left, radical right. But if you go to the other root of the word radical, we're getting to the origin of fundamental. But if we go to the origin of fundamental of anything, it's the origin of thought. And that's where people don't go. People get stuck at the belief, and the belief is where all the emotion lies, but nobody goes down to the thought. So
when with regard to like the question of being right, what sort of progress do you think we would make in terms of having conversations with people if we all sort of kept in mind the idea that, like, I don't know, uncertainty, right?
Absolutely.
To where, and that way it would seem to me, and maybe you can expound on this, is like if you have even your strongest beliefs, let's say they're only 95% certain, you leave that window open to new information, and also perhaps dampen the emotional response.
100%. So taking that right there, I'm just going to use an example. If somebody comes at me, because I've had it happen where a guy was trying to push onto me his KKK beliefs, and he was like, this is da-da-da-da-da-da. And the thing was, I go, you're absolutely right. Because I took the time to read and educate myself on their belief. I read the creed. If they say black people, or you're not pure, you're the divergent of the earth. Well, see, the thing they didn't know is to say I'm the divergent of the earth, that means that I'm absolutely going to do the exact opposite of what the conforming to the majority would say to do. If you say fall down, then I get to get up. Right? So now all of a sudden, that was a compliment to me. But because I said, I understand where you're coming from, and I can see where people are holding on to a heritage like a statue, because now we're speaking to how society has based their life on symbols. If you get back into scripture was speaking to, it wasn't about building churches. That's what man decided to do. Because the church was supposed to be, you could worship him anywhere. Privacy in your home as you're walking, from the inside as you share with another. But we had to put a church on it. And now all of a sudden, if you're not going to church, you're that person who's disconnected from everything else. So you essentially going back to the part of, when somebody believes heavily in where they're at, it's exactly that, a belief. And to acknowledge that, what presupposition in life is, if I'm conscious in what I'm doing, and I'm aware of all the things around me, and I'm not biased in what I take to learn, because I always seek to understand before I speak, I'm always going to be in the driver's seat if somebody's operating from a place of their own personal volition that they believe is their empirical truth, and they're trying to project that onto me.
How do you go about conversing with people who are certain, who are, or maybe seem to you to be like so consumed by their own truth, their concept of their own truth, or their emotional attachment to their truth?
When I get people like that, it's just a matter of asking questions and asking thoughtful questions. Because what I found is, if I ask the right question, they're gonna have to stop themselves. Because I'm not taking control from them. I'm letting them tell me why they're in control.
Right.
And if my thoughtful questions dig deeper than where they're actually thinking, now I've granted candor to now participate in a dialogue, to then challenge, because they're gonna ask that same question back to me.
And do you find that that perhaps doesn't, my experience is it's very difficult to get someone to admit that they've changed their mind in a moment, in a conversation.
Well, that's the thing. Nobody will ever change their mind in a moment.
Right. So you by asking those questions,
you're
planting a seed that they will think about for maybe a month, maybe 10 years.
Exactly, right? And because the question you asked before was, how do you become a person of change in this time? And what it looks like is just that, to have that thoughtful conversation, because I realize people emotionally process at different speeds.
Yes.
I happen to be one who you can have a conversation and I'll go 15 layers deep in the same thought that I'm sharing, where some people need 2 or 3 days to actually go gnaw on it for a little bit.
Yeah.
But because I am aware of that, it puts me in a space where I'm always not worried about my ego. Because now we're going back to ego and attachment to an idea. I'm not attached to any idea.
Right.
Because I'm always open to being influenced by hearing the perspectives of many, because there's always a little bit of truth in what everybody has to share.
Right.
So that's what continues to get me to grow. But that's also part of my now going to what that spiritual journey looks like. If you take a spiritual journey, the spiritual side of it is more so speaking to what is important, what is of value to me. And is it inclusive of society and those around me? Is it inclusive to the community? Because if it's not inclusive to the community, now I'm just being selfish.
What do you mean by inclusive?
Inclusive meaning this conversation right here is an inclusive conversation, because it's not for me to say I'm right in all these things, but it's really to say I'm inviting dialogue, because I'm interested to see where I will be steered in my pattern of thought through the thoughtful questions that you're going to ask. But I also know that by me putting myself out here in the middle of this thing, I've skated around this thing 3 times, people are walking by me again, like, oh, this dude's slowed down and now he's sitting down. Why? Okay, this is different, because I could be that guy out here just skating, just doing me. But because I'm about the human experience, these moments right here are moments that you can't replicate. They come and they go, and the thing about time is it's not guaranteed. There are no refunds on time, and that's the things I respect. If you're taking, for me, I more so follow the universal laws. So if we're getting to the law of compensation, the law of gender, we're getting to the law, everybody knows the law of attraction. But what happens when we're actually dancing into it with intention? Because now we're speaking to that other thing that nobody speaks to, intention. To intentionally be able to ground oneself to say, okay, I know that when I go into this, because I've done the work to understand myself. Most people say they understand other people, but they don't even know themselves, because all they're doing is giving of themselves what they wish someone would have given to them. So when I ask why and what